Thank you, Naomi. Maybe growing up in Hamilton, Ontario, helps one have diverse perspectives on the world. But that's another topic. Okay, well, this paper is a little bit different from the paper on Monday. This one I kind of think of as true scholarship because it came about very often when we write things, we write because they came out of our dissertation maybe, or people asked us to write a chapter for a book, or, you know, it's not something we thought of, but this came purely out of text study. Probably 12 or more years ago, I was studying Talmud with a colleague in Eugene, and we were reading in Tractate Gittin and came across this passage that I'll be sharing with you, and I was so struck by it, and I thought I really have to investigate this sometime when I have time. And I was asked to write for a festschrift for a colleague, and I thought, here's the opportunity. And this was something where I did not know where my study of the passage would take me, and it took me into some quite very unexpected, and I hope you'll agree, interesting paths. All right, so I'll begin by saying the Babylonian Talmud, as we know, is a complex, multivocal, multi-volume document. Its contents were composed from the 1st to 6th century of the Common Era, and it is probably assumed its final written form in the 7th or 8th century in Babylonia or Persia or Iran, whatever we want to call that area. From the time of its composition, it has been seen as a work of literature most representative of Jewish ideas, values, laws, practices, rituals, and culture. Much of the Babylonian Talmud is commentary on an earlier work, the Mishnah, a legal compendium written in Hebrew that was completed in the land of Israel around 200 of the Common Era. The Talmud contains the Mishnah and its exposition, known as Gemara, proceeds according to the contents of the Mishnah, order by order, tractate by tractate, chapter by chapter, Mishnah by Mishnah. Each Talmudic discussion of an individual Mishnah, just a little statement, is called a sugya. And the Babylonian Talmud is cited by the name of the tractate under the discussion and by the recto, the A side, or the verso, B side of each page, based on a definitive printed edition of the late 19th century. While the Gemara of the Babylonian Talmud focuses on legal content, its exposition of the Mishnah also abounds in non-legal material of all kinds, including imaginative expansions of biblical texts and a range of legends, folklore, and anecdotes about individuals and events that were preserved in Jewish popular memory. So, Gittin 55b to 59a is a large and complex passage of the tractate dealing with divorce documents. It's found in the order or division of the Mishnah entitled Women. This sugya, this discussion of a little Mishnah, is a contained unit based on one individual tradition, and it is a reflection on the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple in 70 of the Common Era. And it considers the catastrophic consequences of a range of human moral and ethical failures, real and imagined. While the major purpose of the sugya is to attempt to justify the devastation and suffering brought about through the agency of the Romans, the Talmudic text is also rich in other topics and motifs. And today I will share with you a brief passage within a passage within the sugya on page Gittin 57a, the picture of it on the screen, that demonstrates how rabbinic knowledge of a forensic technique for testing material evidence protected a woman against her husband's fabricated accusation of adultery. I also discuss how this investigative procedure is cited in later Jewish interpretations of the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, found in Genesis 39, where the same forensic test is invoked to absolve a man who was falsely accused of rape by a woman. Interestingly, the same scientific method is also cited in a medieval Muslim source, again in the situation where a woman makes a wrongful accusation of sexual assault. I consider as well how this short passage fits into the larger discussion of physical destruction and psychic devastation in the larger Sugya, Tractate Gittin 55b to 59a. Okay, so our little segment on page 57a presents three traditions that are brought by various sages to explain the destruction of a town called Kfar Sikania of Egypt. This textual unit represents one example among several in the larger sugya that provide moral and scriptural justifications for the destruction wrought by the Romans against various urban settlements, including Jerusalem. All three of the related narratives connected with Kfar Sikania deal with challenging sexual situations, and in each case a righteous resolution is achieved on the human level. In addition to their sexual elements, these stories are also united by their focus on a woman who is either seriously at risk in terms of her marital status or is actually violated. In all three instances, the woman's rights are upheld. A third shared feature of these accounts is their unlikelihood. Each is far-fetched in the extreme in order to make a didactic point about the demands of obedience to revealed Torah. And yet, in the end, the ethical righteousness displayed in these stories is undercut by the harsh reality of divine judgment. Despite its support of justice on these occasions, the town of Kfar Sikania was nevertheless destroyed. The question the rabbis ask, to which I will return, is why? The first tradition in this unit concerns a betrothed couple who were kidnapped by Gentiles and forcibly married to each other. Because the wife lacked a ketubah, a marriage contract, inscribing the legality of her marriage, she asks her husband to abstain from sexual intimacy, which he does throughout their life together. Following his death, the wife laments their sad fate and compares her husband favorably to the biblical Joseph, saying, "Mourn for this man who has kept his passions in check more than Joseph, because Joseph was exposed to temptation for only a short time, but this man every day. Joseph was not in one bed with the woman, but this man was. In Joseph's case, she was not his wife, but in this instance, she was." The second narrative tells of a father and son who both had intercourse with the same betrothed woman on the Day of Atonement. I mean, you try to think of like all the worst possible things that could happen. Their sin was discovered when the price of grain in the town fell precipitously. Well, obviously, there had to be a reason for this. The men were brought to the Beit Din, the Jewish court, and convicted of adultery and stoned, following which the price of grain returned to its original level. The text of the final story on which I focus now is as follows. There was a man who wanted to divorce his wife, but hesitated because her marriage settlement was large. He accordingly invited his intimate friends, sometimes translated as his groomsmen, to a banquet. He fed them well and made them drunk and put them all in one bed. He then brought the white of an egg and scattered it among them. And following this, he positioned witnesses. Then he went to the court and claimed that the man had had relations with his wife. A little far-fetched. There was a certain elder there, one of the disciples of Shammai the elder, named Baba ben Buta, who said, This is what I have been taught by Shammai the elder. The white of an egg contracts when brought near the fire, but semen flows away from the fire. They tested the bedclothes and found that the substance was the white of an egg, and they brought the man to the Beit Din and flogged him and made him divorce his wife and pay her back her ketubah, her marriage settlement. The main reason why, of course, well, we'll talk about this, the resistance of divorce was it could be very expensive to pay the woman back her marriage settlement. So this man was willing to convict his wife of adultery and incriminate his best friends in order to avoid giving his wife back her marriage settlement. The rabbinic institution of the ketubah delineated a husband's obligations, including financial commitments to his wife, both within the marriage and in the event of its dissolution by divorce or death. This requirement of financial restitution to a divorcee offered women a certain amount of protection, since it constituted a strong disincentive to a divorce-inclined husband who would have to raise the necessary funds. However, if a woman violated Jewish law or ritual, or if she refused conjugal relations with her spouse, and echo back to Monday's talk, she could be divorced without her marriage settlement. Proof that she had committed adultery would constitute such a violation. It is from these and other sources that Jewish courts in late antiquity enforced a woman's ketubah entitlements, and this obligation could make divorce extremely expensive. References to men in unhappy marriages who were unable to divorce their wives because of high ketubah payments appear a number of times in rabbinic literature. As Tal Ilan has written, an excellent scholar of rabbinic sources, these difficulties are probably why evidence of divorce, Jewish divorce in the Greco-Roman world, are sparse. The predicament of the husband in the third of the Kfar Sikanya narratives was not uncommon, but his reported solution was extreme. As Ilan has observed, much of the discussion of divorce in rabbinic literature is theoretical and involves absurd situations far removed from the realities of daily life. The important point for me about this case in Gittin 57a is that the nefarious husband's ploy did not succeed, and the rabbinic court protected his wife by scientifically invalidating his evidence. I began my study of this text. This was the text that hooked me, with the hope that in investigating the incident further, I would find a larger pattern of rabbinic defenses of women's rights. If only, yes. Yes. The sage who suggests a forensic examination of the evidence in this third story is Baba ben Buta. He is said to have learned how to distinguish between egg white and semen from his teacher Shammai the elder, a major rabbinic figure of the first century of the Common Era. However, Baba ben Buta is known to have disagreed with his teacher Shammai in certain instances, and the Kfar Sikanya episode appears to be one of these times. The school of Shammai held a strict view on when divorce was permissible, ruling it was only allowed if the wife was guilty of sexual licentiousness. However, in our text, where the wife is proven innocent of adultery, Baba ben Buta compels her husband to divorce her and pay her full marriage settlement, presumably because of his despicable behavior. The resemblance of egg white and semen is taken for granted in this story and is alluded to elsewhere in the Talmud in a medical context. Moreover, the passage in Gittin 57a also confirms that wise men knew a scientific way to distinguish between them. While there are no other instances elsewhere in the Talmud or contemporaneous rabbinic interpretive literature that parallel the egg white for semen deception, in Gittin the ruse appears in some medieval exegetical texts about Joseph and Potiphar's wife. As you'll recall in Genesis 39, the enslaved Joseph became the object of lust of the wife of Potiphar, his master. When she attempted to seduce him, he resisted her vigorous advances and ultimately fled, leaving his garment in her hand. Potiphar's unnamed wife then called her servants and used Joseph's garment as proof that he had tried to rape her. A popular scene in art. The result was that Joseph, once again done in by a coat, ended up in prison, perfectly positioned to demonstrate his skill at interpreting dreams and expedite the next stages of his own and his people's destiny. The earliest introduction of egg white into this story is the text known as Targum Yerushalmi, or also known as Targum Pseudo-Jonathan. This Aramaic translation of the 5 books of Moses is enhanced with frequent additions of unique and often otherwise unknown legendary material. It was likely composed in the land of Israel somewhere after the 7th or 8th century. While most of the Targums, biblical translations into Arabic, which were intended for synagogue reading in the presence of a diverse audience, did not include what one scholar calls coarse and vulgar language, especially in matters related to sex, the Yerushalmi often introduces rather indelicate expressions into the text when these could easily have been omitted, says the scholar. Most scholars conclude that this literary work was not intended for synagogue use and is more a commentary than a translation. A number of these general qualities of Targum Yerushalmi characterize its account of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Targum Yerushalmi brings traditions about this biblical episode that do not appear in earlier extant rabbinic writings, and the author does not shy away from indelicate content. Thus, Targum Yerushalmi's rendition of Genesis 39 explicitly states that Potiphar's wife used egg white to look like semen in order to strengthen her accusation of rape against Joseph. And the relevant text, that's yet another picture of our, a medieval picture. And the relevant texts are as follows. With the addition, the green, or whatever color that is, it's a biblical text, and then the white is the addition from Targum Yerushalmi. And when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled into the street, she threw the white of an egg on the bed, called the members of her household and said, "See the effusion of semen that this fellow has scattered, the Hebrew man whom your master brought to jest with us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out in a loud voice." The Targum further adumbrates the biblical text, describing how the deception about the egg white was discovered. The author of Targum Yerushalmi builds as well on a tradition found in many earlier midrashic sources that state that Potiphar never actually believed in Joseph's guilt. Again, the additions to the biblical text are in white. Joseph's master took counsel from the Egyptian priests, who on examination discovered that it was the white of an egg. So he, Potiphar, did not put Joseph to death, but he did put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were imprisoned, and he remained there in prison. It's interesting that the actual scientific process of distinguishing egg white from semen described in Gittin 57a does not appear here. Moreover, a question that remains unanswered in this rewriting of Genesis 39 is why Potiphar, who has now been convinced of Joseph's innocence, still punishes the young man by putting him in prison. Targum Yerushalmi refers to the tradition about the egg white once more in its expansion of Genesis 47, which details how Joseph gained possession for Pharaoh of all the farmland of Egypt during the long famine. So this is chapter 47, verse 22. Only the land of the Egyptian priests he did not buy. This is from the Bible. Now we know why, because they had seen his innocence at the time when his master wanted to kill him, and they had delivered him from the sentence of death. Okay. Yes. These traditions in Targum Yerushalmi, including the attempt by Potiphar's wife to incriminate Joseph with egg white, his exoneration due to forensic knowledge of the priests, an authoritative group of wise men, together with Joseph rewarding the priests by permitting them to keep their land, constitute a tidy midrash that proceeds directly from the prompts in the biblical texts. As scholars have noted, this process of narrative building is typical of this document. As with Jewish interpretation or midrashic method in general, Targum Yerushalmi's additions to the biblical narrative are driven by the text itself. In the case of Genesis 39 and 47, these prompts had also led to elaborate explanations in earlier midrashic texts. Thus, in Targum Yerushalmi, Potiphar's wife draws her servants' attention to the egg white when she says, "Look." Earlier traditions had understood "look" to refer to Joseph's garment, which Mrs. Potiphar had grasped when Joseph made his escape, as in this painting by Rembrandt, where she is pointing, "Look at the red garment on the chair." Okay. Similarly, the tradition of Potiphar's consultation with the priests in Targum Yerushalmi proceeds from the biblical language in Genesis 39:20, which literally reads, "And the master of Joseph took him and had him put in prison." This led some exegetes to ask where Potiphar had taken Joseph before arranging for his imprisonment. We could read it as the master of Joseph took him and later had him put in prison. Moreover, the fact and the answer was that he had asked the priests of Egypt to investigate the case. Moreover, the fact that Potiphar had Joseph imprisoned but not executed, given the nature of his crime, required clarification. One explanation, as in Targum Yerushalmi, was the priests found Joseph innocent. But again, if innocent, why put him in prison? One agadic teaching from the 5th century Rabbinic Midrash collection, Genesis Rabbah, answers as follows. Potiphar said to him, "I know you are not guilty of so vile a crime, but I must imprison you, lest a taint cling to my children." That is, if their mother's behavior was publicly known, she would be disgraced, and their legitimacy could be questioned, since she may have been guilty of adultery on other occasions. Along the same lines, the author of Targum Yerushalmi wondered why Joseph did not expropriate the land of Pharaoh's priests as he did with the land of all other Egyptians, and again suggested Joseph was rewarding them for proving his innocence of the accusations of Potiphar's wife. An elaborated version of the encounter between Joseph and Potiphar's wife, incorporating the element of the egg white, the priest's forensic test, and their affirmation of Joseph's innocence, as well as Potiphar's explanation why he still was consigning Joseph to prison, appears in a midrash collection called Seichel Tov. This work was completed in 1139, probably in Rome, by Menachem ben Solomon ben Isaac, a figure about whom little is known. Midrash Seichel Tov relates that Potiphar's wife spread egg white on her couch after Joseph fled and showed it to her servants and then to her husband to incite his wrath. In a third reference to the egg white in this midrash, after Joseph's master took him, and again in this case the biblical text, the biblical text is in green and the comment in white. And Joseph's master took him. This means that he brought Joseph to the priests and they examined the matter. They said, put a flame to this white stain, and if it bubbles and disappears, it will be evident that it is semen and he is guilty and liable to death. And if it cooks, then it will be known that this is egg white and he is innocent. They examined it and they found that they found it was egg white, and they freed him. His master said to him, I know you did not do this thing, but nevertheless I am taking you from my house in order not to put a blemish on my children. And back to the text, and he had Joseph placed in the prison. Midrash Seichel Tov thus unites the salient elements of the traditions about Potiphar's wife, Joseph, and the egg white, although this work does not make a connection between the priest's role in proving Joseph's innocence and Joseph's generosity in allowing them to keep their lands. And it appears probable from this work, that it was from this work, Seichel Tov, that the story about Joseph, Potiphar's wife, and the egg white entered the mainstream of rabbinic interpretive literature. And in fact, if you go online and start Googling egg white, which is fascinating in itself, but egg white and Joseph and Potiphar's wife, you can find some modern versions of the story. So, traditions about Mrs. Potiphar's deceptive use of egg white do not appear explicitly in Gittin 57b, or indeed elsewhere in the Talmud or contemporaneous midrashic writings. However, I would suggest that the tradition existed as part of the oral treasury of popular Middle Eastern Jewish folklore, or maybe simply Middle Eastern folklore. This would account for the inclusion in Targum Yerushalmi, which, as I mentioned, is characterized by its incorporation of agodic or legendary content that does not appear in earlier extant sources. It is significant, though, that the initial narrative in our three tales about Kfar Sekanya in Gittin 57a, back to the beginning, does provide an excursus on the Joseph story. You'll recall that in story about the betrothed couple, the wife who requested that her husband abstain from sexual relations with her because he had not given her a proper marriage contract, lamented after his death that her husband surpassed Joseph in his ability to resist temptation over so long a period of time. The juxtaposition of this account of extreme sexual restraint, which directly invokes the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, with the subsequent narrative about the man who falsely accused his wife of adultery with egg white, is not, I think, an accident. The existence of an ancient popular tradition that Potiphar's wife had tried to entrap Joseph with egg white is not improbable, and no doubt the reference to the Joseph story in the Kfar Sekanya unit, as well as other textual prompts to which I will return shortly, encourage the anecdote about the man who used egg white to try to entrap his wife. And in fact, corroborating evidence of this connection is found in the 14th century exegetical Yemenite compilation of legends, biblical exegesis, called Midrash Hagadol. In its discussion of Genesis 39:14, Joseph and Mrs. Potiphar, the comparison between Joseph and the sorely tried husband of Gittin 57a is brought in and expanded with further examples of righteous biblical men who resisted sexual temptation in extreme situations. While Mrs. Potiphar is not accused of using egg white in this text to incriminate Joseph, it is noteworthy that Midrash Hagadol on Genesis 39:14 concludes by incorporating the entire Kfar Sekanya unit, the three stories, including the false accusation of adultery based on egg white. While one might have expected the initial narrative about the unconsummated marriage to be cited, the fact that the whole unit is incorporated seems to indicate popular association among Adwite seamen and Potiphar's wife. Several scholars have suggested that the Kfar Sekanya unit in Gittin stands alone, with little connection to the rest of the Talmudic Sugya segment, which, as you recall, is about the destruction of Jerusalem and neighboring towns by the Romans. However, a closer look calls this view into question. Beyond the fact that Kfar Sekanya participates in the larger themes of destruction that result from human disobedience to divine mandates, it is also the case that there is a reference to semen earlier in the Sugya. This is in Gittin 56b 57, in a striking narrative which recounts that a certain Onkelos, the son of Kalonikos, the son of the Roman Emperor Titus's sister, was considering conversion to Judaism. Since Titus is blamed for the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple, the inclusion of a story about Titus's nephew is not completely out of place in the larger destruction of in a larger discussion of this catastrophe and its causes. According to this tradition, the potential convert Onkelos is said to have used magical arts to raise various enemies of Israel from the dead. These included Balaam, the Gentile prophet who was hired by the king of Moab to curse Israel. On his journey, Balaam encounters an angel blocking his path, but is not able to see it. Only his ass sees the divine messenger and refuses to move, finally rebuking his master in human language, or its master. When Balaam subsequently attempts to curse Israel, only blessings emerge from his mouth. How goodly are thy tents, O Jacob. Ma tovu haveha Yaakov. In Numbers 25, subsequently, Balaam, not having learned his lesson, colludes in encouraging Israelite men to idolatry and sexual immorality with the daughters of Moab, bringing a terrible plague on the Israelites. Balaam's responsibility for these disasters is cited as justification for his death in battle in Numbers 31:16. The passage in B. Gittin 57a reads as follows. Onkelos, Titus's nephew, asked Balaam, "Who is respected in the other world?" Balaam replied, "Israel." Onkelos asked, "What about joining them?" Balaam quotes Deuteronomy 23:7, "Thou shalt not seek their peace, nor their prosperity, all thy days forever." Onkelos then asked, "What is your punishment?" He replied, "With boiling hot semen." The rabbis were nothing if not imaginative, and this punishment that fits the crime probably triggered the connection with another tradition that involves semen and played a role in the inclusion of our Kfar Sekanya unit in Gittin 57a. Directly following the dialogue between Onkelos and the resurrected Balaam is the potential proselyte Onkelos raises Jesus from the dead. While Jesus is also depicted as being punished in the world to come for his imputed heresy, he does not speak of the Jews in hostile terms. What is important in this much discussed passage for our present purposes is that the mention of Jesus may also have played a role in the inclusion of the Kfar Sekanya unit in this segment of Gittin, since the town of Kfar Sekanya is associated with Christianity in rabbinic tradition. Oh, here, I forgot to, yeah, okay. Yes. The designation of the town as Kfar Sekanya of Egypt, Mitzrayim, is almost certainly a later alteration, probably in response to medieval censorship, of Kfar Sekanya of the Notzrim. Kfar Sikanya of the Nazarenes or the Christians. There is no certainty as to the exact location, but most scholars believe it was in the greater Galilee area and perhaps not far from Sepphoris, an area that became extensively Christian over the course of the 4th and 5th centuries. The Talmud twice mentions a Christian physician of Jewish origin who came from this town. So the association of Kfar Sikanya with Christianity may explain the reason for its destruction in B. Gittin. And here's the quote. Said Abaya, a rabbinic figure to Rabbi Joseph, since the town people were so virtuous in the 3 cases that we discussed where they, exonerated, where they found the guilty guilty, why were they punished? And he replied, because they did not mourn for Jerusalem. Many scholars understand the split between Judaism and Christianity and early Christians, Jews and early Christians, to have been finalized, as it were, by the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era. Jews understood the catastrophe as a punishment for sin, and they sought divine forgiveness in expectation of an ultimate messianic redemption. They often characterize it as a dispute between husband and wife where the spouses separate but ultimately will reunite. Christians, on the other hand, interpreted this disaster as a divine rejection of the Jews and an affirmation of the truth of the new Israel based in the Christian community and its church-based beliefs and ritual practices. Thus, from the rabbi's point of view, a Christian town like Kfar Sikanya would not have lamented the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple. It is these links among the traditions about Joseph and Potiphar's wife, Balaam, sexual licentiousness and semen, Christians and Kfar Sikanya, and the rabbinic justification of the destruction of the town because it did not mourn for Jerusalem that so strongly unite our small segment and explain its place within the larger sugya of B. Gittin 55b to 59a. I have suggested that stories about failed attempts to prove adultery and rape through using egg white as a substitute for semen appear to have been part of a shared body of traditions in the Middle East and Levant. A central theme in the sources I have cited also emphasizes that legal authorities had the forensic expertise to disprove such false allegations. Thus, it is fascinating, and thank you, Internet, if not surprising, that a similar episode is cited in the writings of a Muslim jurist. And you'll forgive, a theologian and commentator on the Quran, Muhammad ibn Abu Bakr, also known as Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who lived in Syria between 1292 and 1350. In his legal text, al-Turuq al-Hukmiyah, etc., al-Sharia, the following tradition appears. Oh, okay. Yes. I just will read the beginning that I didn't type in here. There was a consensus among the prophets, companions, and the rightly guided caliphs about using qarina, that is circumstantial evidence, prior to issuance of a verdict. And generally speaking, they were skeptical about circumstantial evidence. A woman complained to Caliph Umar that she had been raped. She happened to fall in love with a youth from the Ansar, but he paid no attention to her. She was angry with him. She took egg white and rubbed it on her clothes and between her thighs. Then she came to Umar, crying that the man forced her to have sex and degraded the honor of her family, showing the marks on her clothes and body. Umar consulted ladies of Medina, and they said that they found semen on her clothes and body. The accused man replied, "O Amir al-Mu'mineen, please reinvestigate my case. In the name of Allah, I never committed the crime, nor did I love her. She tried to seduce me, but I refused." Umar again consulted Ali. He asked permission to recheck the proof. He took very hot water, poured it on the woman's cloak, and it boiled the egg. He took the cooked egg, smelled it, and tasted it. He concluded that it was an egg, not semen. He interrogated the woman, and she confessed that it was a trick. So here too, we see the use of the same scientific method by religious and judicial authority to demonstrate the falsity of an accusation of a sexual crime. To conclude, I began this study out of fascination with the forensic technique applied in Gittin 57a to absolve a woman of a false accusation of adultery brought by her husband. I hope to find other instances of forensic activism by rabbinic judges in favor of female plaintiffs, but I did not. It is certainly the case that rabbinic legislation and jurisprudence provided a protection for women through the institution of the ketubah, the marriage contract, requiring unhappy husbands to abide by its financial requirements, prevented rash divorces, and limited the number of indigent divorcees dependent on community support. However, my researches on the Kfar unit led me in quite different directions. Perhaps most surprising was the connection to the biblical story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife, and the discovery that in some medieval renditions of Genesis 39, that scorned woman is said to have used egg white to falsely incriminate the man who rejected her. It became evident that the resemblance between egg white and semen was an attested, if minor, motif in Middle Eastern folklore accounts of fabricated accusations of sexual impropriety. Moreover, in the surviving literary versions, this was not a ruse in which women were always passive victims of male iniquity. Rather, egg white was an equal opportunity deception employed by both female and male characters who, at least in our existing testimonies, were always discovered and punished. Although, except in Gittin 57a, it is always women who perpetrate this deception in the examples I have found. The pathways of scholarship are winding and infinitely rewarding, and sometimes they circle around to where we began. In this case, my research led not only to Jewish midrashic traditions that continue to be cited in the present, but also into the byways of Jewish-Christian relations in the late ancient land of Israel and legal traditions from the early days of Islam. My dissertation and my first book, Pharaoh's Counselors, studied three biblical Gentiles: Moses' father-in-law Jethro, Job, and the foreign prophet Balaam in rabbinic and early Christian biblical interpretation. My second monograph, Midrashic Women, delineated the rabbinic understanding of women as essentially other and lesser than men, both physically and morally. Perhaps it was inevitable that in this late career investigation, which was intended to focus on women and their legal protections in rabbinic writings, I would come back again both to Balaam, simmering in his cauldron of boiling semen, as well as rabbinic assumptions about the untrustworthiness of women who, among their many other failings, attempt to entrap men with egg white. Thank you.